It was a night like any other, or so Grace Turner thought. The wind howled fiercely, slamming rain against the windows of the small farmhouse she'd inherited from her late uncle. The house creaked and groaned under the weight of the storm, as though the memories of the past were trying to break free, like the ghosts that had long been haunting it. It had been months since Grace had moved here, away from the bustling streets of Boston, seeking solitude in the quiet corners of Vermont. The house, cold and empty, seemed to mirror her heart, scarred by years of a broken marriage and the weight of choices she couldn't undo. But tonight, the storm felt different. A strange, unfamiliar cry pierced through the winds, so sharp and raw it sent a shiver down her spine. At first, Grace thought it was the storm playing tricks on her, but the sound came again, louder this time. It was a cry of pain, desperation, something alive and suffering. Without hesitation, she grabbed her flashlight and rushed out into the rain, her boots sinking into the mud as she ran toward the woods behind the barn. The storm was relentless, soaking her to the bone within seconds. But the cry guided her, pulling her through the trees like an invisible force. She barely noticed how the branches scratched at her skin, her thoughts consumed by the sound. And then she saw it. There, tangled in the barbed wire of the old fence, was a horse. Its once glossy coat now matted and muddy, its eyes wide with terror. The horse was shaking, blood seeping from a gash on its side, and it could barely lift its head. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as she approached slowly, instinctively aware that any sudden movement could send the animal into a frenzy. Her mind raced, thoughts spiraling. What was a horse doing out here in this storm? How had it gotten like this? She didn't know anything about horses. Not really. But she couldn't leave it there, not when it was so clearly suffering. With trembling hands, she began cutting through the wire, each slice of the metal feeling like a tug at her heart. The horse's pain was palpable, each soft whimper breaking her resolve. When she finally freed it, the animal collapsed, too weak to stand. Grace didn't know what to do next. She didn't even know how to help a horse. But one thing she knew for sure was that she couldn't leave it here. This poor creature, abandoned and broken, was a mirror of the life she had just escaped. She couldn't let it suffer in silence, like she had for so long. She ran back to the barn, retrieving the tractor from the nearby shed. Her hands were slick with rain and fear, but her mind was focused, sharp. She drove the machine back to where the horse lay, using the tractor to gently lift the animal's fragile body. The rain was coming down in sheets now, but Grace didn't care. She was already soaked, already exhausted. She just needed to get the horse to shelter. By the time she managed to get the animal inside the barn, her legs were weak, her arms burning with effort. The horse lay still in the straw, its breathing shallow, its body trembling from the cold and shock. Grace stood over it, her heart racing. What was she doing? She was just a woman who had come here to escape, not to play savior. A voice from behind her made her jump. "You shouldn't have done that," said the vet, a short, gruff man with a face weathered by years of experience. Grace spun around. "What do you mean? I couldn't just leave it out there?" The vet stepped closer, examining the horse. His face softened, but there was no mistaking the gravity in his words. He's too far gone. Best you can do is ease his pain." "You're not a miracle worker, ma'am." Grace swallowed hard. She could feel the weight of the vet's words pressing down on her chest. But no, she couldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything. Not after the horse had already suffered so much. "I won't give up on him," Grace said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. The vet gave her a long, searching look, then sighed, shaking his head. "You're wasting your time, but I'll leave you to it," he muttered, his boots clomping against the barn floor as he walked away. But Grace wasn't listening anymore. She was already kneeling beside the horse, running her hand gently over its damp coat. She couldn't explain why, but something deep inside her told her She had to save this animal. Perhaps in doing so, she could save herself too. The days following Ember's rescue felt like a blur to Grace. The storm had passed, but the cold, damp air still clung to the earth, refusing to let go. Inside the barn, the flickering light from an overhead bulb cast long shadows, making the space feel even more intimate, more isolated than it already was. Ember lay in the straw, his body exhausted from the battle he had fought just to survive. He barely moved, except for the occasional tremor that ran through him, as if the scars of his past were embedded deep within him, beyond the reach of mere healing. And Grace spent her days beside him, as much out of instinct as necessity. She had no idea what to do, no manual to guide her through the process of rehabilitating a horse. But there was one thing she understood: the power of presence, the power of just being there. And so she stayed. She sat on a stool near his stall, watching him closely, feeling the weight of the silence between them. Every now and then she spoke to him in a soft voice, reading aloud from the books she had brought from Boston. She wasn't sure if he could understand, but she believed that the sound of her voice would bring him comfort, even if only a little. She tried playing soft music through the old radio she found tucked in a corner of the barn. Classical music, the kind her mother used to play when Grace was a child. A comfort that had always brought her a sense of peace. The first few days, Ember didn't eat. He didn't even acknowledge her presence, except for the occasional flick of his ears when she got too close. But Grace persisted. She cleaned his wounds, changed the bandages, and spoke to him like he was a part of her family, a quiet member who needed space but deserved care. It was all she could do. Then, on the fourth day, something changed. Ember's ears twitched. Then his nostrils flared as he sniffed the air. Grace sat still, holding her breath, not wanting to scare him. Slowly, cautiously, Ember raised his head. His movements were slow, deliberate, like every muscle in his body was unsure whether it could trust the motion. His gaze met hers for the first time since he had arrived. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as if time had suspended itself in that brief, quiet exchange, the only sound being the soft shuffle of the straw beneath Ember's hooves. Grace's heart raced, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something she couldn't name. She saw the pain in his eyes, the raw, unspoken grief of a life abandoned and broken. But there was something else, too, a flicker of hope, just barely visible, as if the possibility of healing was beginning to take root. And then Ember did something unexpected. He shifted his weight, slowly moving to stand. His legs wobbled beneath him, the muscles weak from disuse. He stumbled, nearly collapsing, but Grace was there in an instant, her arms reaching out to steady him. He flinched at the touch, his body stiffening as if every part of him had learned to fear human contact. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. "I'm here to help you, Ember. I won't leave you." The horse's eyes softened for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of her words, before he sank back down into the straw. It wasn't much, but it was a victory. He had tried to stand. He had trusted her enough to make the effort, even if it ended in failure. That was enough for Grace. It had to be. The next few days followed the same pattern. Ember would rise, try to stand, and then fall back into the straw. Sometimes he would take a few steps, but his legs would give out, and he would collapse again. The process was slow, painful even, but it was progress. Each small victory felt like a mountain climbed, and Grace, despite her own exhaustion, found herself rooting for him. She found herself believing in him. But even as the days passed, the wounds on Ember's body remained, silent reminders of the cruelty he had endured. His coat, once glossy and proud, now hung in ragged clumps, and his eyes were haunted, as if the memories of his former life as a prized racehorse still lingered in the back of his mind. Grace wondered what horrors he had faced, what betrayals had left him so broken. She didn't know his history, but the signs were clear. There was a darkness in him that couldn't be erased with a few days of care, and yet Grace couldn't help but feel that there was something redeemable in him, something worth saving. As the days grew into weeks, Ember began to show signs of improvement. He started eating, albeit reluctantly. He drank water when Grace offered it, though it took time for him to trust the food she gave him. His body seemed to remember how to function, slowly but surely. His eyes lost a bit of the haunted look, and his coat began to regain some of its shine. It was a slow process, but it was happening. Still, Grace knew that Ember's physical healing was just the beginning. The real battle was within him. The invisible wounds that no one could see. The pain, the fear, the memories of a life stolen from him. As she watched him struggle, she realized that he wasn't the only one fighting. She was too, fighting her own ghosts, her own past. Her divorce had left her empty, broken in ways she didn't want to acknowledge. And just like Ember, she was learning to trust again, learning that healing wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul. One evening, as Grace sat beside Ember's stall, a young girl appeared in the doorway. She had a curious look in her eyes, her face framed by a mop of wild dark curls. It was Lily, the daughter of a local farmer, who had begun visiting the barn over the past week. She had watched from a distance at first, unsure of how to approach, but something in Ember's recovery had drawn her in. "Is he getting better?" Lily asked, her voice soft and hesitant. Grace looked at the horse, who was now lying quietly in the straw, his eyes half closed in a rare moment of peace. "Yes," Grace said with a nod. "He's getting there." Slowly. Lily smiled. "I can help," she said, stepping closer to the stall. And for the first time in weeks, Grace felt a spark of hope, not just for Ember, but for herself as well. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this. Maybe there were others who would help her heal too. As the weeks went by, Grace found herself becoming a familiar sight at the local diner. Though she rarely joined in the chatter of the townsfolk, her presence was quiet, reserved. Just another woman trying to make a life in a small town that didn't quite know what to make of her. She had come to Vermont to escape the ghosts of her past, to rebuild a life that felt more authentic. But the locals weren't so sure about her decision to bring Ember, the wounded racehorse, into their midst. The barn where Ember now lived had become her world. But it wasn't long before whispers began to follow her everywhere. A horse like that, a creature of such value once upon a time, now broken and abandoned, was too much of a spectacle for a quiet town like theirs. Grace overheard them in the diner, the elderly women at the counter clucking like hens, their words laced with judgment. "She's gone and lost her mind, you know," one of them said, her voice carrying across the room. "Bringing that horse into her barn, thinking she can fix him? A horse like that's done for. Just a waste of time." Another woman, her face hard with disapproval, nodded. "They say he was a champion once, a prize fighter, but now, a cripple, that's all he is. She's wasting her time. There's no coming back from that." Grace didn't look up from her coffee, though she could feel the weight of their words. She had learned to tune out the criticisms from the past, from the divorce, the judgments that had followed her every step. But here, in this small town, it felt different. They didn't know her. They didn't know what Ember meant to her, or why she couldn't let him go. The town wasn't ready to accept her, nor did it seem inclined to, but she wasn't here for them. She wasn't here for their approval. Her mornings began to blend into each other, the routine becoming a form of comfort. She would tend to Ember, clean his wounds, brush his coat, and then read to him or play music, hoping the sound would soothe him. Slowly, Ember grew stronger, bit by bit. He still flinched at sudden movements, still recoiled at the slightest touch, but he was starting to show signs of real life beyond his pain. There were days when he would stand a little longer, his legs trembling but holding firm. There were moments when he would eat, albeit sparingly, but it was something. And for Grace, something was enough. She had become emotionally tied to him, and the more he healed, the more she felt herself healing too. One afternoon, while Grace was cleaning up around the barn, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see a teenage girl standing by the door, her hands shoved into the pockets of a worn, oversized jacket. Her hair was a tangled mess of dark curls, and she wore a look of quiet curiosity. Lily. She had been visiting the barn every day for the past week. At first, she had stood at the fence, watching from a distance, but recently she had started coming closer, offering to help with the daily tasks, though Grace hadn't quite figured out why she kept coming back. Lily shuffled her feet nervously as Grace approached. I heard them talking in the diner, she said, her voice low and hesitant. Grace raised an eyebrow. About me? Lily nodded, avoiding Grace's gaze. They said you're wasting your time with that horse, that he's too far gone. Grace sighed softly, setting down the rake she had been using. People like to talk, she said, her tone softer than she intended. They don't understand. Lily took a step closer, her eyes drifting to Ember's stall, where the horse was lying, his head raised slightly as if he could sense their presence. I don't think you're wasting your time, she said quietly. I think he's getting better. Grace turned to look at her, her expression softening. Lily's words, though simple, struck something deep inside Grace. For a moment, she wondered if anyone had ever believed in her like Lily believed in Ember. It was a thought she quickly brushed aside, but it lingered. Thank you, Lily, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. That means more than you know. Lily smiled faintly, her gaze turning back to the horse. Can I help? With him? I mean, I don't know anything about horses, but I can learn. I want to help. Grace studied the girl for a moment, her eyes softening with a mix of caution and curiosity. Lily was young, barely a teenager, but there was something about her that seemed sincere. She wasn't like the others who had dismissed Ember without a second thought. Maybe, just maybe, she could be the kind of person who could help Grace heal, not just from the wounds Ember carried, but from the ones Grace had been hiding all her life. I could use some help, Grace said after a moment, her voice steady. But first, you need to promise me something. Lily looked up at her, her eyes wide with anticipation. What? That you won't give up. Not on him and not on yourself, Grace said, her voice firm but gentle. We're in this together. All right? Lily nodded, her face lighting up with a small but sincere smile. I promise. From that day forward, Lily became a fixture in the barn. She showed up every morning, ready to help with anything Grace needed. At first, she was awkward and unsure, but as the days passed, she began to grow more comfortable, more confident in her ability to care for Ember. Grace found herself teaching her the basics of horse care, how to groom, how to feed, how to spot the signs of distress. In many ways, teaching Lily felt like a form of healing for Grace as well. It gave her something to focus on, something to nurture besides Ember. But the whispers from the townsfolk never stopped. They were quieter now, but still, they persisted. Some of them even found it odd that Lily, a local girl, had become so involved with the horse. She's just a kid, they would say. What does she know about a horse like that? Grace heard their comments, but she paid them no mind. She had long since stopped trying to prove herself to anyone. She was doing this for herself, for Ember, and for Lily too. Together, they were building something, even if the town didn't understand it. One evening, after a particularly long day of work in the barn, Grace sat down on the old wooden bench by the door, watching Ember as he stood in his stall, his head held high. He wasn't fully healed, not yet, but he was trying, and so was she. And for the first time in a long time, Grace felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better for them both. It was a crisp afternoon when Marta appeared at the barn. Grace had been working in the stables for hours, checking on Ember's progress, cleaning the tack, and ensuring everything was in order for another evening of care. She hadn't expected anyone to visit. Not after the town's cold reception of her efforts. She had come to terms with the isolation, with the quiet way she moved through life now. Ember was her focus. She didn't need anyone else. But then Marta came, a presence that seemed to belong to another time. The old woman was small but sturdy, her back straight as she walked toward the barn. Her face, weathered by years of sun and wind, was lined with deep wrinkles, but her eyes held a sharpness that immediately caught Grace's attention. She moved with the grace of someone who had seen more than her fair share of life's struggles. Grace had heard whispers about Marta before, stories that circled the town like old familiar gossip. She was a former jockey, someone who had lived a life on the racetrack and knew the world of horses better than anyone, but that had been years ago. Now she was a shadow of her former self, her presence more legend than fact. Marta's boots scraped against the dirt floor of the barn as she approached, and Grace instinctively stood straighter. The older woman's gaze flicked over to Ember's stall, and she stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the horse. "You've got him?" Marta said, her voice hoarse but steady. "The black one." Grace raised an eyebrow, unsure of what the woman meant. "Yes, his name is Ember," she replied, a little guarded. "He's been here for a few weeks now." Marta's expression softened, but there was something in her gaze that made Grace's pulse quicken, a mix of recognition and something deeper. She stepped closer to the stall, her eyes never leaving the horse. "I know him," Marta murmured, almost to herself. "I knew him when he was racing. They used to call him Thunderstrike, one of the fastest horses on the circuit. But that was a long time ago." Grace felt a chill run through her. She had known Ember's past was a tangled web, but hearing it from someone else, someone who had seen him when he had been a star, it made the wounds on his body feel all the more tragic. You know him?" Grace asked, her voice soft, full of curiosity. Marta nodded, her lips pursed. "I was a jockey back in the day, not a very good one. But I knew the horses, I knew the trainers. Thunderstrike wasn't always like this. He was a legend, a prize winner. But something happened." She paused, her eyes darkening. "They pushed him too hard, drugged him, and when he finally broke, they discarded him. He was too damaged for the track. They left him to rot." Grace stood silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of the words. The hurt and betrayal in Marta's voice were palpable. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to think that the world of racing, the sport she had once admired from a distance, could be so cruel. But Ember's scars, both visible and invisible, told a different story. She glanced over at the horse, who was lying down in his stall, his large, sad eyes watching Marta with a quiet recognition. "Why didn't they take care of him?" Grace asked, her voice thick with emotion. Marta sighed, the weight of the years pressing down on her shoulders. "Because in that world, when you stop winning, you stop being valuable. They see you as nothing but a tool, something to be used and discarded. When Thunderstrike couldn't race anymore, they didn't want him. He was a broken machine. They didn't care if he had a soul or a life worth saving. They just left him." The words hit Grace hard. She could feel the depth of the betrayal that Ember had suffered. It was a kind of pain she knew well, a pain that came from being abandoned when you were no longer useful, no longer wanted. It was the same kind of pain she and Mia had felt in her marriage, when she had been cast aside like an old, worn-out thing. She swallowed hard, trying to push the emotions down. "Why didn't you ever try to help him?" Grace asked, her voice gentle but probing. Marta gave her a long, considering look. "I couldn't. Not in that world. I wasn't important enough. You had to play by their rules, or you were left behind. I've seen horses like him before. The ones that break under the pressure, most of them don't survive. And the ones that do are never the same. Grace's heart clenched at the thought of Ember, once a champion, now reduced to this shadow of himself. She looked back at the horse, his coat still ragged and his body thin, but the spark in his eyes had begun to return. Ember was more than just the broken horse everyone thought he was. He was more than the sum of his scars. I think he's not just broken, Grace said, quietly, her voice filled with conviction. I think he was betrayed, and now he just needs to know he's safe. Marta's eyes softened as she looked at Grace. Maybe, but it's not easy to heal a horse like him. It's not just about feeding him or giving him shelter. It's about getting to the heart of the wound, the one that runs deeper than the body. That's the hard part. He's not the only one who's been broken, you know. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly what Marta was implying. She had her own scars, ones that no one could see. She had come here to hide, to escape her past. But the truth was, she couldn't run from her own wounds. She had to face them, just like Ember had to face his. The two women stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding heavy in the air. Then Marta turned, giving Ember one last lingering look before nodding to Grace. If you're really going to help him, you have to do more than heal his body, Marta said softly. You have to heal his spirit. That's where the real work begins. Grace watched her as she walked away, the old woman's words echoing in her mind. Ember wasn't just another project, another horse to fix. He was a living, breathing soul, and his healing would require more than care. It would require trust, the kind of trust that Grace had yet to give herself. As the evening light began to fade, Grace stood beside the stall, watching Ember. He was still broken, but he wasn't beyond repair. Neither of them were. The days that followed Marta's visit felt like a turning point for Grace. The words she had spoken, that Ember's healing wouldn't just be physical, but spiritual, lingered in Grace's mind. She knew Marta was right. The journey ahead would require more than just time and care. Ember needed to believe again, and so did Grace. They were two broken souls, each carrying a lifetime of scars, each needing to find redemption in their own way. Grace found herself standing outside the barn one evening, her hands resting on the rough wooden fence, staring at the now stable figure of Ember. His once ragged coat had started to shine again, and his body had filled out, though he was still a far cry from the horse he once had been. But the strength was there, buried beneath the layers of past pain. His eyes had softened, no longer clouded by fear, but full of quiet curiosity. Grace could see that he was ready, maybe not to race, but to move forward. He was no longer the broken creature she had first found on that stormy night. Lily, ever present now, stood beside her, brushing a thick coat of dust from Ember's flank. Her connection to the horse had grown just as strong as Grace's. In many ways, Lily's youthful optimism had been the anchor that kept Grace from slipping into despair. The girl believed in Ember with the same intensity that she believed in herself, and that belief had a power all its own. Grace watched them both, the bond between them evident. It was clear that Ember had begun to trust Lily. She spoke to him in a soft, steady voice, moving with the confidence of someone who had grown alongside the horse. It was the kind of trust Grace had been hoping for, from Ember, from herself, and from the world around her. But even as the horse healed, Grace's doubts lingered. She wasn't sure she was ready for the next step. She had spent so long running away from her own life, hiding from her past, that the thought of putting herself out there again, of risking more pain, terrified her. But Ember was ready, as he was no longer just a broken animal. He had become a symbol of strength and resilience. His recovery was a reminder that healing didn't come without its share of struggle. It was Lily who broke the silence one morning. She had been quietly watching Ember as he grazed in the field, and she turned to Grace with an idea that took the older woman completely by surprise. "Why don't we enter him in the Spring Hill charity race?" Lily asked, her face lit with excitement. He's stronger now, Grace. I know he's not fully healed, but I can feel it. He's ready. He deserves a chance. Grace froze, her heart skipping a beat. The idea was absurd. Ember wasn't ready for any kind of race. He was a broken horse, still learning how to trust again. The thought of pushing him into a competitive situation was beyond what Grace had planned. But then, looking at Lily's eager expression, Grace felt the weight of her own doubts. Maybe she was holding on to her own fear, not just Ember's. She had avoided taking risks her entire life, first with her marriage, and then with her decision to leave everything behind and retreat to this remote farm. Maybe it was time to take a chance on something. Maybe it was time to let Ember take that chance, too. I don't know, Lily, Grace said slowly, her voice filled with uncertainty. He's still recovering. We can't rush this. Lily's expression faltered for a moment, but then her determination returned. I'm not saying we make him race, Grace. I'm saying we give him the chance to run again. No pressure, just let him be free for a little while. Maybe that's what he needs. To remember what it feels like to move without fear. The words hit Grace harder than she expected. To run without fear. It was something she hadn't done in a long time herself. She had spent so many years paralyzed by fear. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of making the wrong choices. But Lily was right. Maybe Ember's recovery didn't need to be about winning. It could be about freedom, a chance to be something more than a broken horse. With a deep breath, Grace nodded. All right, we'll enter him in the race. But no pressure, remember? This isn't about winning. It's just about giving him the chance to be free. Lily beamed with excitement, her joy infectious. I knew you'd say yes. I'll sign him up. I'll tell the organizers everything. That it's just for fun, just to let him stretch his legs. And so it was decided Ember would run in the Spring Hill, her charity race, not to win, but to run again. Grace wasn't sure if it was the right decision, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was alone in it. Lily's belief in the horse, in them both, gave Grace a sense of hope she hadn't realized she needed. The day of the race arrived, and Grace felt a knot of nerves twist in her stomach. The barn was quiet that morning as she prepared Ember, brushing his coat and checking his hooves one last time. His coat gleamed now, and his muscles were firm beneath the surface. But it wasn't just his body that had changed. Ember's spirit had started to heal too. His eyes were no longer clouded by the shadows of his past. There was something bright in them now, something alive. When they arrived at the track, the atmosphere was alive with excitement. The crowd was small, a charity event after all, but the energy was palpable. Grace stood by the fence, watching as Ember was led toward the starting line. She could see the tension in his body, the way he pranced nervously on his hooves, but he didn't shy away. He didn't panic. He was there. The gate lifted, and Ember hesitated for a moment, as though deciding whether to take the leap. Then, as if the wind had called to him, he surged forward, his hooves striking the dirt with a rhythm that felt as old as the earth beneath him. He didn't run fast, not like he had before, but he ran with everything he had, with freedom. The crowd cheered as Ember crossed the finish line, not in first place, but in a way that made everyone realize something more important. He was alive. He was here. And Grace? She wasn't sure she had ever felt more alive. The day of the race was overcast, with thick clouds hovering low in the sky. A soft drizzle fell steadily, wetting the ground and creating a sheen on the tracks. Grace stood at the edge of the makeshift racetrack, feeling a quiet apprehension crawl over her skin. The crowd was small, just a handful of spectators gathered under umbrellas and raincoats, waiting for the charity race to begin. It wasn't the grand spectacle of a major event, but to Grace it felt like the most important race of her life. Beside her, Lily bounced on her heels, her excitement palpable despite the dreary weather. Grace had never seen her so enthusiastic, her face bright with hope and anticipation. Ember stood a few paces away, tethered to a post, his coat glistening in the damp air. The horse had come a long way since that stormy night when Grace had first found him, broken and near death. As now, there was a spark in his eye, a vitality that hadn't been there before. He didn't look like the scared, trembling animal that had stumbled into her life. He looked like a horse with a future, with purpose. The race wasn't about winning, it was about freedom. About giving Ember the chance to run without the weight of his past bearing him down. But as Grace looked at him now, she felt the weight of her own emotions, fear, hope, and the deep yearning to see him succeed. She had watched him struggle, fought with him through each small victory, each minor setback. They had both come so far, and she couldn't help but feel that this moment was as much for her as it was for him. "Grace, he's going to be amazing," Lily said, her voice filled with conviction. She was practically glowing with excitement, her face a mixture of hope and youthful belief. Grace smiled faintly, though the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. "I hope so, Lily. But remember, it's not about winning. It's just about letting him run." Lily nodded enthusiastically, her hands clasped in front of her. "I know, but I can feel it. He's ready." Grace couldn't help but share a brief moment of quiet optimism with the girl, but deep down, she wondered if she was fooling herself. She had watched Ember hesitate at the starting line, his body tense with nerves, his breath coming in short bursts. He wasn't the same powerful racehorse he once had been, not by a long shot, but there was something undeniably strong about him now, something that told Grace that even if he didn't cross the finish line first, the journey itself would be enough. The announcer's voice rang out, startling Grace from her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Spring Hill Charity Race. We have a few brave competitors today, but it's clear that the heart of the race lies with the horses themselves." The crowd cheered politely, and the sound of applause mingled with the soft patter of rain. Grace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She glanced at Ember once more. His coat gleamed even in the misty light, and though his muscles still bore the marks of injury, there was a grace to the way he moved, a reminder of the champion he once was. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment she felt an unspoken connection between them, as if he understood everything she had been through, as if he knew the journey they had taken together. He wasn't just a horse anymore. He was her companion, her friend, her equal. The gate lifted and the horses began to move forward. For a few moments, Grace held her breath. Ember hesitated at first, his legs shaking beneath him, but then he began to move, slowly at first, unsure of himself, his hooves landing heavily against the damp ground. He wasn't galloping, not at first, but with each stride he grew bolder. His pace quickened, his gait more assured. He wasn't running to win, not in the traditional sense. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was simply running, with the wind in his mane and the rain splashing against his coat, free. The crowd began to cheer as Ember pushed forward, his legs gaining strength with every step. Grace could hear the excitement in their voices, the way they shouted his name. "Ember! Ember!" As though they had forgotten, like her, that this race was never about winning. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful. It was about redemption. It was about finding freedom in the face of everything that had tried to break them both. Lily's voice cut through the noise, her enthusiasm ringing clear. "Look, Grace, he's doing it." Grace's heart skipped a beat. The sight of Ember running, his head held high, his body moving with grace and power, made her feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. He wasn't just moving forward physically. He was moving forward emotionally, too. Each step was a victory, a step toward healing, not just for him, but for her as well. The finish line was in sight. Ember was ahead of a few of the other horses, but it was clear he wasn't trying to be first. He wasn't racing against them. He was racing against his own past, against the shadows that had haunted him for so long. As the crowd cheered, Grace could see him approaching the final stretch. His body was still strong, still moving with a quiet determination that took Grace's breath away. He was no longer the broken animal she had found on that stormy night. He was something more, something powerful, something alive. As the horses crossed the finish line, Ember wasn't the first to arrive, but that didn't matter. The crowd erupted into applause anyway. There was something different in the way they cheered for him. Something reverent, or something acknowledging the journey he had taken, the courage he had shown. Grace stood at the edge of the track, watching Ember slow to a trot, his breath heavy but steady. He hadn't won the race, but he had won something far more important. He had proven to himself and to Grace that redemption was possible, that it wasn't too late to find the strength to run again, no matter what had happened in the past. Lily rushed forward to meet Ember, her hands outstretched, a look of pure joy on her face. Grace followed slowly, her heart swelling with pride. She didn't need the accolades or the recognition. She didn't need to hear the applause. All that mattered was the quiet, unspoken victory that lay between her and the horse that had saved her, and that she had saved in return. As Ember's head turned toward her, his eyes soft and peaceful, Grace realized the truth. This wasn't about winning a race. It was about what came after. The healing, the growth, and the promise that even the most broken things could find a way to move forward. The day after the race, Grace found herself staring at the television screen in the small farmhouse, the faint sounds of the morning news playing in the background. Her fingers absent-mindedly brushed through her coffee mug as the screen flashed with images of the previous day's charity race, a blur of horses, riders, and cheering crowds. But one image stood out, a close-up of Ember, his glossy black coat gleaming beneath the gray skies. The shot captured him mid-stride, his powerful legs pushing forward with determination, his mane flying in the wind. "Woman saves forgotten racehorse," the headline read, followed by a brief segment about Grace's unexpected heroics. It was strange. For weeks, Grace had kept herself and Ember hidden away from the eyes of the town, the media, and the expectations of the world. She didn't want the attention, didn't need the recognition. She had brought Ember home to heal him, not for praise or accolades. Yet now, there he was, being shown to the world, his story carried across local news broadcasts, capturing the hearts of viewers who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. It was hard to ignore. The media had found their new feel-good story. The underdog horse, the woman who wouldn't give up, and the small-town farm that had become a sanctuary for both of them. Grace sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She had been living in a bubble, wrapped in the quiet safety of her farm, with only the company of Ember, Lily, and Marta. She hadn't expected the world to suddenly take notice. It was overwhelming. The phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. Grace hesitated for a moment before picking it up. "Hello?" she answered, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "Miss Turner?" A voice on the other end was polite but eager. "This is David Carver from Channel 8 News. We've been following your story and wanted to know if you'd be willing to do an interview. We'd love to feature Ember's recovery and how you've turned things around for him." Oh, Grace's stomach turned. The thought of sitting in front of a camera, speaking to strangers, made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She wasn't one for the spotlight. But she couldn't deny that there was something in the tone of David's voice that made her pause. There was genuine curiosity, and perhaps even a bit of respect. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not really interested in interviews," Grace said, her voice firm but polite. "I didn't do this for the attention. Ember's recovery is all that matters." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft chuckle. "I understand, Miss Turner. I really do. But we've been getting quite a bit of attention for the story. People are fascinated by your journey in Ember's transformation. I think it's important to share it with the world. Grace glanced at the television again, the image of Ember's triumphant run from the day before still fresh in her mind. She thought about all the people who had cheered for him, who had seen the hope in his eyes as he ran, free for the first time in years. Maybe this was bigger than just her. After a moment's silence, Grace sighed. "All right, I'll do a short interview, but only if we can keep it focused on Ember. I don't want to make this about me." David's voice brightened immediately. "Of course, Miss Turner. We'll make sure the story stays focused on Ember's journey. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. I'll set something up for later this week." Grace hung up the phone and let out a long breath. She wasn't sure what to expect from the media circus, but part of her knew that Ember's story had already started to reach people in ways she couldn't have predicted. He was more than just a horse now. He was a symbol of resilience, of second chances, of hope in the face of everything that tried to break him, and maybe, just maybe, that was something worth sharing. A few days later, the camera crew arrived at Emberlight Farm. Grace felt the familiar stirrings of discomfort as she stood at the edge of the barn, watching the equipment being set up. The noise, the flashing lights, the attention, it was all too much. She wasn't used to being the center of anyone's attention, let alone on television, but she reminded herself that this wasn't about her. This was about Ember, about giving him the recognition he deserved for everything he had endured. The interview was set to take place in the barn, where Ember stood calmly, his mane gently blowing in the breeze, his eyes soft but alert. Lily, as always, was by his side, brushing his coat with a tenderness that reflected the bond they had developed. Grace stood at a distance, her hands clenched in front of her as the crew prepared for the interview. David Carver, the reporter, was kind but professional, his voice soothing as he introduced himself and asked Grace a few basic questions about Ember's condition and how she had found him. As the questions progressed, Grace grew more comfortable, her answers flowing more easily. But when it came time to talk about Ember's transformation, her voice caught in her throat. "Ember wasn't just a horse to me," Grace said, her eyes misting as she looked at the animal beside her. "He was a reminder that no matter how broken we are, we can still find a way to heal. I didn't think I was saving him. I thought I was saving myself. And I think we saved each other." David nodded, his gaze shifting to Ember, who stood quietly, his head held high, his body strong and proud. It's clear that he's more than just a recovery story," he said, his tone sincere. "He's a living example of perseverance, and so are you." Grace smiled faintly, though the words felt heavy in her chest. She wasn't looking for accolades. She didn't want to be recognized for her actions. But as the interview continued, she realized that maybe Ember's story, their story, could inspire others who were struggling. Maybe they weren't the only ones who needed to hear that healing was possible, no matter how broken you felt. As the interview concluded, Grace felt a strange sense of relief. The pressure of the media spotlight had been overwhelming, but she had made it through, and now she could return to what mattered most. Ember, Lily, and the farm they had built together. Later that evening, as the sun set over the fields, Grace stood at the fence, watching Ember as he grazed peacefully. The world might have recognized his journey, but to Grace, Ember was still the same horse who had taught her what it meant to be strong. And as she watched him, she realized that it wasn't just the world that needed to see Ember's story. She needed to see it too. A story of survival, of second chances, and of the quiet power that came from running free. The day after the interview aired, Grace stood at the edge of Emberlight Farm, looking out over the fields, watching the horses graze in the distance. The television segment had captured Ember's story, and for a brief moment, the world had taken notice. The phone had not stopped ringing since then. Messages of support, offers to visit, letters of gratitude. Even the local newspaper had printed a special piece about the forgotten racehorse who had found redemption. It was overwhelming, to say the least. Grace had never anticipated any of it. The attention felt like a double-edged sword. While she was glad that Ember's story was being shared, a part of her longed for the quiet of the past, the isolation, the small world she had built in the barn. Just her and Ember, the idea that others would now come to visit, to see what they had created, both excited and terrified her. But then came something unexpected. One afternoon, a young woman in her early 20s showed up at the barn. Her name was Clara, and she was a local volunteer with a program aimed at helping troubled teens. Her soft, worn jeans and oversized sweater gave her an air of quiet determination as she introduced herself to Grace. "I've been working with some of the kids in the area," Clara said, her eyes shy but hopeful, "and I thought maybe they could benefit from seeing what you've built here, from seeing how a horse like Ember can heal." And Grace's heart clenched with surprise. She wasn't sure what Clara meant by benefit, but there was something about the woman's words that sparked an idea in her. Maybe the healing that had begun with Ember and herself could extend beyond the two of them? "Maybe," Grace replied, her voice soft but curious. "But these kids, are they ready for something like this?" Clara hesitated, but the determination in her eyes never wavered. "Some of them are struggling with things like anger, isolation. They've been through a lot. I thought it might help to show them that recovery takes time, that even when things are broken, they can still heal." Grace thought about the offer for a moment. She had always been hesitant about involving others in what she had built with Ember. The barn, the sanctuary. It had become their safe place, and the thought of opening it to others felt like a risk. But Clara's words resonated deeply with her. The idea of offering a space for others to heal, for them to experience the power of redemption and growth, was something Grace had never considered. "What do you have in mind?" Grace asked, finally, her voice softer than before. "I'd like to bring a few of the teens here," Clara said. "Maybe twice a week. They could spend time with Ember, learn how to care for the horses, and maybe learn to trust themselves again in the process." Grace didn't answer immediately, but she couldn't ignore the way the idea tugged at her heart. The farm had become a sanctuary for Ember, but what if it could become a place of refuge for others? What if this was the next step in their own healing process? Not just for her, but for those who had nowhere else to turn. After a long moment of silence, Grace nodded. "All right, let's try it. But we'll start small. Just a few kids, and we'll see how it goes." Clara's face broke into a grateful smile. "Thank you, Grace. I promise you won't regret it." The first day the teens arrived at Emberlight Farm was a mixture of uncertainty and curiosity. There were 5 of them, teens with closed-off expressions, some more reluctant than others, and none of them particularly eager to be there. They'd come from difficult backgrounds, each of them carrying a heavy weight of their own pain and isolation. Some had been in trouble with the law, while others had simply fallen through the cracks of the system, and none of them seemed particularly interested in horses. And Grace could feel the tension in the air as they entered the barn. But Clara, ever optimistic, encouraged them to give it a chance. "Just try it," she said, her voice kind, but firm. "You don't have to like it. Just let yourself be here." Grace watched them warily, wondering if she had made a mistake. The kids' guarded eyes made her question the decision, but as Clara guided them through the barn, introducing each of them to the horses, something unexpected began to unfold. Slowly, they started to soften. They touched the horses with tentative fingers, their curiosity overcoming their reluctance. Ember, still strong but patient, stood quietly, letting them come to him. His presence, once frail and unsure, now exuded a calm strength that seemed to draw them in. Lily, now an integral part of the farm's daily life, helped guide the teens in the basics of horse care, showing them how to brush the horses, how to be gentle and patient with these animals that had been through their own struggles. At first, the teens were hesitant, unsure of how to interact. But Ember's calm demeanor and the trust Lily had built with him began to work wonders. Slowly, the teens began to open up, speaking about their own struggles as they worked with the horses. There was Marcus, the quiet one, who had been in and out of trouble for years. He had a wall up, and at first he refused to engage with Ember. But as the days passed, something changed. He started talking to the horse while brushing his coat, murmuring words that seemed more for himself than for Ember. It was slow at first, but eventually he started showing the horse more affection, and with that affection came a subtle shift in Marcus's own demeanor. Then there was Jasmine, who had a fiery temper and a deep sense of distrust in the world around her. She often pushed the boundaries, questioning everything Grace said, challenging her authority. But when she began to connect with one of the other horses, a mare named Bella, something in her softened. She would talk to Bella in quiet tones, brushing her coat as though the mare understood her better than anyone else. Over time, her harsh exterior began to crack, and Grace noticed that Jasmine's interactions became less hostile, more open. Each day, the teens began to reveal more of themselves, their pain, their fears, their need for something to hold on to. Emberlight Farm, a place that had started as a sanctuary for Grace and Ember, had become a place of healing for them too. As the weeks passed, Grace watched the transformation with awe. She had never imagined that her quiet corner of Vermont would become a place of refuge for so many others. But it wasn't just the teens who were healing. Grace herself was changing. Through the process of teaching, of guiding these troubled teens, she began to heal in ways she had never anticipated. She learned that she wasn't just saving these kids, they were teaching her too. Teaching her patience, teaching her to trust, teaching her that even in the darkest moments, there was light. The farm had become more than just a place of recovery for Ember. It had become a beacon for others, a place where healing was not just possible, but where it was happening day by day, horse by horse. It had been a quiet afternoon at Emberlight Farm. The usual sounds of hooves on the barn floor, the gentle murmur of voices from Lily and the teens as they worked with the horses, and the distant calls of birds from the surrounding fields were all that filled the air. Grace had spent the day tending to the farm, going through the motions of routine that had become second nature to her. It felt like she had found a rhythm here, something steady, something that made her feel whole again. She had given herself to this place, to Ember, to the kids, and in return, they had helped her rediscover pieces of herself she had long since forgotten. But today was different. As Grace worked in the barn, a car pulled up to the driveway, the sound of tires crunching against gravel breaking the quiet of the afternoon. Grace glanced up, her brow furrowing as she wiped her hands on her jeans. Visitors were rare, and most of the time, they were expected, like Clara, or the occasional visitor from the local animal shelter. But this car was unfamiliar, its sleek, black exterior standing out against the rustic backdrop of the farm. The car came to a stop near the barn, and a tall figure stepped out. Grace could immediately tell this was no local. The man was dressed sharply, his clothes out of place in the dusty, weathered surroundings of the farm. He was middle-aged, his face still sharp despite the passage of years, his dark hair streaked with silver. He wore expensive shoes, a crisp suit jacket, and carried an air of authority that made Grace instinctively take a step back. Her stomach turned as he approached, and a knot tightened in her chest. She knew that look. The kind of person who didn't belong here, yet had come with a purpose. She felt the tension building as he stopped just a few feet away, his eyes scanning the barn before settling on her. He didn't smile. His expression was serious, almost cold. "You must be Grace Turner," he said, his voice low but commanding. Grace nodded, crossing her arms instinctively, a shield against the unfamiliar presence. "Yes, I'm Grace. Can I help you?" The man didn't offer a handshake, and his eyes flickered momentarily toward Ember, who stood nearby, grazing quietly. It was clear he was aware of who the horse was, or at least who he had been. His lips tightened slightly as he turned back to Grace. "I'm Thomas Hargrove," he said, his tone clipped. "I'm here about the horse." At the mention of Ember, Grace's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to expect from someone who had come all the way to a remote farm, but the last thing she had anticipated was someone like him. Someone who clearly didn't belong in this quiet world she had carefully cultivated. His next words only confirmed her worst fear. "I'm the one who used to own Ember," he said, his gaze now fixed squarely on her. "I've come to buy him back." The words hit Grace like a punch in the gut. She stared at Hargrove, momentarily speechless. It was as if the world had shifted beneath her feet, the ground no longer stable. She had known, deep down, that someone might come looking for Ember, someone who had once owned him, who had once thought of him as nothing more than an asset, a commodity. But hearing it from this man, hearing the coldness in his voice as he spoke of Ember like a possession to be reclaimed, made her stomach churn. Grace took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. He's not for sale," she said firmly, her voice colder than she intended. Hargrove's expression didn't change. He wasn't used to being told no. He crossed his arms, mirroring Grace's posture as he regarded her. "I think you misunderstand," he said, his voice smooth but condescending. "Ember was a valuable asset, and I intend to reclaim what's mine. I'm offering you a generous sum, the kind of money you won't find in this part of the world." Grace felt the anger bubbling up inside her. It wasn't just the offer. It was the way he spoke of Ember, as though he was a mere transaction. She had seen that attitude before, in her marriage, in the people who had never seen her as anything but a means to an end. But this time, she wasn't going to back down. This was different. This was Ember, the horse who had healed her, the horse who had fought through the pain to find his own redemption. "He's not for sale," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "And I'm not interested in your money. Ember is home. This is where he belongs." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. For a moment, Grace thought he might argue, push harder, but instead, he sighed, his shoulders slumping as though conceding a point he hadn't wanted to. "I see," he said quietly. "You're attached to him. That's understandable." Grace didn't respond, though she felt her anger simmering beneath the surface. She wanted to ask him how he could have abandoned Ember so easily, how he could have let a creature who had once been a champion suffer in such a way. But she held her tongue, knowing that there was no point in arguing with someone like him. "What you don't understand," Hargrove continued, his voice taking on a different tone, "is that Ember's value goes beyond the farm. He's worth more than you realize. And if you truly cared about him, truly wanted what was best for him, you'd sell him back to me." The words stung, but Grace refused to let them affect her. She had seen too much in Ember, seen his growth, his strength, and the way he had come to trust her. She couldn't let this man take him away, couldn't let him treat Ember like an object to be claimed. She had worked too hard to build a life here, a life that was meaningful. "He's not a prize to be won, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice unwavering. "He's a living, breathing creature who deserves to be loved and cared for. You lost him the day you stopped believing in him. He's not for sale. Not now. Not ever." Hargrove's jaw tightened, and for a moment Grace wondered if he would lash out, demand Ember be handed over. But instead he gave her a curt nod, turned on his heel, and walked back to his car, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Grace watched him leave, the finality of the moment sinking in. Ember had been abandoned once, but he wouldn't be again. Not on her watch. As she turned back toward the barn, she saw Ember standing by the fence, his eyes watching her. For a brief moment, Grace wondered if the horse understood what had just transpired. Maybe he did. What Grace knew for sure was this: Ember wasn't going anywhere. He was home. And she had learned that home wasn't just a place. It was a feeling. It was the safety she had built here, the love she had found for herself and for him, and no one could take that away. The winter months crept in quietly, the first dusting of snow falling across the farm in gentle flurries. The stillness of the landscape seemed to echo the peace Grace had found in her life. Emberlight Farm, once a place of retreat, had become a symbol of growth, not only for the horses who found refuge there, but for the people who had stepped through the barn doors. The transformation had been subtle but profound. It wasn't just the horses who were healing anymore. It was the troubled teens who had found solace in the rhythm of the barn, the steady companionship of the animals. And it was Grace herself who had learned to trust again, to believe that redemption wasn't just for horses, but for people, too. On this particular afternoon, Grace stood at the fence, watching the horses as they grazed peacefully in the snow-covered field. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the landscape, and for the first time in a long while, Grace felt a deep sense of contentment settle within her. The farm had come to life in a way she had never imagined, and though she had fought so hard to preserve its solitude, she knew that this was what she was meant to do, like to give something back, to let the farm become a place of healing for others, just as it had been for her. Ember stood near the fence, his black coat gleaming in the fading light. The once wounded racehorse who had been cast aside and left for dead was now a figure of strength and freedom, galloping through the snow with the same grace he had once shown on the racetrack. His eyes were full of life, a far cry from the fear that had once haunted them. He had found his place here, just as Grace had found hers. Lily stood beside her, her face bright with a smile as she watched the horses. "It's like a dream," Lily said softly, her voice filled with awe. "They're all so free, and Ember, he's finally where he belongs." Grace glanced over at the girl, her heart swelling with pride. Over the months, Lily had become more than just a helper on the farm. She had become a partner, a friend, and someone who had grown alongside the horses and alongside Grace. Together, they had built something that felt bigger than themselves. The sanctuary wasn't just for the horses or the kids who came to visit. It was for Grace, too. It was a reminder that even the most broken things could find a way to heal, to thrive, and to grow. "I never imagined it would be like this," Grace admitted, her voice soft as she gazed out at the field. "I didn't think I was capable of something like this. I thought I was too broken and too far gone. But now, look at us." Lily chuckled and nudged Grace playfully. "You've done it, Grace. You've made a home here. For all of us." Grace smiled, but the weight of the words didn't escape her. She had spent so many years feeling unworthy, feeling like she was a failure. The divorce, the years spent lost in a life she had never truly chosen, had all led her to this moment. It was only here at Emberlight Farm that she had found the courage to be herself, to heal, to let go of the past and move forward, not as the woman who had failed, but as the woman who had rebuilt. "Maybe we all found each other at the right time," Grace said, her voice filled with quiet emotion. I couldn't have done this without you, Lily. Without Ember. Without everything this farm has given me." Lily nodded, her expression softening as she looked at the horses. "It's a special place, and it's special because of you." They stood there in silence for a moment, watching as Ember galloped across the snow-covered field, his mane flying in the wind. There was a sense of freedom in the way he moved, an exuberance that spoke to the healing that had taken place, not only in his body, but in his spirit. He had been through so much, had suffered in ways Grace couldn't even imagine. But he had found his way back to life. He had found his place in the world. As they watched him run, a sound interrupted the quiet, the crunch of footsteps in the snow. Grace turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Marta walking toward them, her slow, steady steps purposeful as always. The old woman's face was lined with years of wisdom, and yet there was a warmth in her eyes that spoke to the deep bond she had formed with the farm, with the animals, and with Grace. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marta said, her voice carrying across the crisp air. Grace nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It is. He's finally free. Marta walked closer, her gaze following Ember as he slowed to a trot. He's been free for a while now, Grace, but sometimes it takes us a little longer to see it. Grace's breath caught as she turned to Marta, unsure of what she meant. The older woman gave her a knowing look, her eyes softening as she glanced between Grace and the horses. You've healed too, you know, Marta said gently. You've given so much of yourself to this farm, to these horses, to those kids. But what you might not see, Grace, is that you found your own freedom. You've allowed yourself to believe again, to trust again. And that's something powerful. Tears stung Grace's eyes as she looked at the farm, at the horses, and at the people who had become her family. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain, the heartbreak, the fear, and how far she had come since that stormy night when Ember had first stumbled into her life. He had been a symbol of everything broken, everything discarded. But now he was a symbol of resilience, of second chances, of the quiet strength that came from embracing one's past and finding a way to move forward. I never thought I could be happy again, Grace said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. But this farm, these animals, they've given me more than I ever expected. They've given me a life, a family. Marta placed a hand on Grace's shoulder, her grip firm but warm. You've earned it, Grace. And now, you have a place to call home, a place where you're not just surviving, but thriving, where you're free to be who you truly are. Grace turned to look at the horses once more, her heart swelling with pride. Ember galloped through the field, his body strong and powerful, his spirit as wild as the wind. The farm had become his sanctuary, just as it had become hers. And for the first time in a long time, Grace realized that she had found something even more precious than freedom. She had found peace. As the snow continued to fall softly around them, Grace stood there, watching the horses run. The farm was alive with the sounds of healing, with the quiet joy that comes from knowing that sometimes the things the world casts aside can be the very things that carry us home.